He stood at the edge of the water, watching it move faster than he expected. On the other side was food, safety, and his group waiting for him. In between was a current strong enough to sweep away anyone who misjudged it, with no bridge, no rope, and no second chance if he got it wrong. What he actually did next was not the obvious choice most people assume, and by the end of this, you will understand why the safest way across a river almost never involved swimming straight through it. Stay through this one, because the actual method used here depended on reading water carefully, in a way most people never think to look for. To understand what crossing a river actually meant to an ancient human, you first have to understand that rivers were rarely optional obstacles. They separated groups from food sources, from other communities, and sometimes from safety itself during a chase or an escape. Choosing not to cross was often not a real option at all. The real challenge was figuring out how to do it without drowning, without losing supplies, and without exhausting himself before he even reached solid ground on the other side. The first decision point had nothing to do with swimming at all. It was choosing where along the river to cross. Ancient humans who lived near a river for any length of time appear to have developed a detailed mental map of which sections were slower, which were shallower, and which hid dangerous currents beneath a deceptively calm surface. Water that looked completely still on top could still be moving fast and dangerously underneath, especially in narrower sections where the river had to push the same volume of water through a smaller space. This is exactly why narrower sections of a river were often more dangerous, not safer, despite looking like a shorter and easier crossing point. A wider, shallower stretch, even if it meant walking further to reach it, usually meant slower moving water spread across more surface area, giving a person far more control and far less risk of being pulled off his feet entirely. Reading the surface of the water became a genuine survival skill. Small ripples moving inconsistent, even patterns usually indicated calmer, more predictable currents. Sudden disruptions, swirling patches, or areas where the surface texture changed abruptly often signaled submerged rocks, sudden depth changes, or fast-moving currents beneath. Ancient humans who crossed rivers regularly likely built an almost instinctive sense of these visual cues over years of repeated exposure, long before they could have explained the physics behind any of it. Now think about this for a moment. If you were standing at the edge of an unfamiliar river with no rope, no boat, and no way to test the depth except by stepping in, what do you think your first move would actually be? Walk the bank first to look for a better spot. Test the water with a stick, or just commit to the nearest point and go. Leave your answer below, because the instinct people describe here often reveals a lot about how they weigh patience against urgency under pressure. Using a long stick or branch to test depth and current strength before stepping forward appears to have been an extremely common practice. This simple tool gave an ancient human information about the riverbed without risking his own footing, letting him detect sudden drop-offs, slippery rocks, or unexpectedly strong pull in the water before his body was already committed to that exact spot. Crossing at an angle, rather than straight across, was another key strategy. Moving directly against a strong current wastes enormous energy fighting the water head-on. Ancient humans appear to have instead angled their crossing path slightly downstream, allowing the current to carry them gradually across, rather than resisting it completely. This meant covering more actual distance along the river, but using significantly less energy and facing far less risk of being knocked off balance by fighting the water in a straight line. Groups crossing together developed their own coordinated methods. Some evidence suggests ancient humans sometimes crossed rivers in a connected line, each person gripping the shoulder or arm of the person ahead, using the combined weight and stability of the group to resist the current far more effectively than any individual could alone. If one person began to slip, the connected line gave others an immediate chance to steady him before the current pulled him under. Carrying belongings across presented its own, separate problem. Anything that needed to stay dry, tools, food, or fire-starting materials, had to be kept above the water somehow. Ancient humans appear to have used simple methods like bundling items in tightly wrapped hide and balancing the bundle on top of the head or shoulders while waiting, keeping both hands free for balance and for reacting quickly if footing became unstable. There is a physical detail about river crossings that most people never consider, and it changes how dangerous a seemingly simple crossing really was. The riverbed itself was rarely a flat, predictable surface. Smooth stones, often coated in a thin layer of algae or moss, could be far more slippery than they appeared, especially in shallower sections, where feet made direct contact with the bed rather than swimming above it. Ancient humans who crossed regularly likely developed a careful, shuffling step rather than a normal walking stride, sliding their feet forward along the bed instead of lifting them fully, reducing the chance of a sudden slip on a hidden slick surface. Body positioning relative to the current mattered as much as the path chosen. Facing directly into an oncoming current exposed the full front of the body to its force, while turning slightly sideways reduced the surface area pushing against a person at any given moment. This small adjustment in stance, combined with a slightly lower crouch to keep the body's center of weight closer to the riverbed, gave ancient humans meaningfully more stability in moving water than standing fully upright and facing the flow directly. The width of a river did not always correlate with how long a crossing actually took either. A narrow but fast-moving section could take longer to cross safely than a wider, but gentler stretch, simply because a person moving cautiously against strong current covers distance far more slowly than someone moving confidently through calmer, shallower water. Ancient humans weighing these trade-offs were essentially calculating risk against time long before either concept existed as a formal idea, using nothing more than direct observation and accumulated experience from prior crossings. Group order during a crossing also carried hidden importance. Positioning the strongest or most experienced person at the front of a connected line meant that individual absorbed the first and often the most forceful resistance from the current, effectively breaking its force slightly for those crossing directly behind him. Placing a second capable person at the rear of the line meant anyone struggling in the middle had support on both sides, rather than only from one direction, significantly reducing the chance of someone being swept away unnoticed. If this part surprised you, that crossing at an angle used less energy than fighting the current directly, that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it shows how much of ancient survival depended on working with the environment rather than against it. Weather and season changed everything about how a river needed to be approached. A river that was calm and shallow during a dry season could become dangerously swollen and fast after heavy rain or seasonal snowmelt upstream, sometimes with very little visible warning at the crossing point itself, if the rain had fallen somewhere far away. Ancient humans who lived near rivers long-term likely developed an awareness of seasonal patterns, understanding which times of year required extra caution or an entirely different crossing location than the one used during drier months. Not every group had this kind of long-term familiarity, though. A group traveling through unfamiliar territory, forced to cross an unknown river for the first time, faced a genuinely more dangerous situation. Without prior knowledge of the river's behavior, they had to rely entirely on the visual reading skills described earlier, testing depth carefully, watching the surface pattern, and moving slowly rather than assuming anything about how the water would behave. Animals occasionally provided useful information here as well. Watching where animals chose to cross, particularly larger animals with established movement patterns through a region, could hint at naturally shallower or safer crossing points that had been used successfully for generations. Even if the ancient humans watching had no way of knowing exactly why that particular spot worked so consistently, cold water presented a danger that had nothing to do with the current at all. Extended exposure to cold water could rapidly drain body heat, leading to weakness, confusion, and reduced muscle control long before drowning became the primary risk. Ancient humans crossing colder rivers likely moved as efficiently and quickly as possible once committed, understanding, even without a name for the concept, that spending unnecessary time in cold water carried its own serious danger separate from the current itself. The aftermath of a successful crossing mattered nearly as much as the crossing itself. Reaching the opposite bank exhausted, cold, and soaked meant a person was temporarily far more vulnerable to predators or simple accidents than usual. Groups appear to have prioritized quickly finding shelter, warmth, or at minimum a safe resting point immediately after crossing, rather than continuing on exhausted and unprotected in an unfamiliar area. Nighttime crossings, when they became unavoidable, added an entirely different layer of danger. Without clear visibility of the surface patterns that normally guided a safe crossing decision, ancient humans forced to cross after dark had to rely almost entirely on sound and touch, listening for changes in the water's noise that might indicate rapids or deeper sections ahead, and testing every step carefully with a stick before committing any real weight forward. Groups appear to have avoided night crossings whenever possible, only attempting them under genuine emergency circumstances where waiting until daylight was simply not a safe option either. There is one more detail worth mentioning before we close. The individuals within a group who became known for reading river conditions accurately, choosing safe crossing points, or guiding others through difficult water, likely held real informal value within their community, not through strength or speed, but through a kind of accumulated environmental judgment that could mean the difference between a group crossing safely together or losing someone to a river that looked calmer than it actually was. So the next time you picture an ancient human standing at the edge of a river, remember that the crossing itself was rarely a blind leap into moving water, and it was almost never treated the same way twice. It was a careful, learned process built on reading currents, choosing location wisely, and working with the water's natural movement rather than fighting it directly. And in many cases, that exact judgment was the only thing separating a safe crossing from a genuine disaster. If this kind of detail is exactly what you come here for, this channel is built entirely around real moments like this, the specific decisions and instincts that never make it into the usual retelling of ancient human life. The small details that actually determined who made it safely across and who did not, and staying around from here on means you will not miss the next one.